Chapter 5 Oppositions. The first 3, technical philosophical, chapters are however also an exposition and a laying in place of what may be thought to be, for Hegel, the great opposite number of dialectical thinking, and that is the mode of thought called Verstand or understanding. As we have already seen, this is the thinking attributed to common sense, ordinary natural empirical thinking, of the type systematized in philosophy by Aristotle and later on, with a somewhat different dimension, by Kant, whose works are monuments to what may be called the working ideology of everyday life. As such, then, it is not so much a question of refuting this kind of thinking, without which none of us could live or function in what remains a Newtonian universe at the level of our bodily experience, as it is the drawing of boundaries and the designation of limits and insufficiencies. It is interesting to compare this philosophical program with Kant's, which was equally concerned to draw lines and to demarcate the claims of reason, but where Kant wished to suspend the illicit speculations about metaphysical areas, in which only belief is appropriate, Hegel, reinvigorating the pretensions of what he explicitly calls speculative thought, wishes systematically to unmask and to denounce the attempt to think the thought of reality in terms of what we may call spatial thinking. The thinking of externalities and of quantities. For this kind of thinking, technically called Verstand or understanding, following Kant's usage, is a thinking organized around the law of non-contradiction, a thinking for which only one pole of a given opposition or antithesis can be true at one time. But it is perhaps better not to approach Hegel's well-known dialectical unity of opposites in the mystical spirit it has so often seemed to express, better, perhaps, to begin to grasp its consequences in terms of that structuralism which, whatever its limits, has seemed for some, including myself, to signal a reawakening or a rediscovery of the dialectic. This would indeed be the moment to stage a generalized celebration of the binary opposition, as it freed us from the static substantialism of Aristotelian logic, and like so much contemporary philosophy, but in a far more strident and programmatic way, sought to promote relationality and the primacy of process and relativity, differences without positive terms as Saussure famously put it. Indeed, as we shall see, the most authentic way of grasping the dialectic will be the one able to think Hegel without positive terms. However this may be, it is certain that the Phenomenology is a profoundly structuralist work of and la lettre / and we could do worse than enumerate the various binary oppositions at work singly and in multiple combinations throughout these early chapters. We have already, in examining language, had to come to terms with that between the individual and the universal, but we have not insisted on the binary form that in fact regulates the play of those two terms, along with so many others in the later chapters, and that is the opposition between the essential and the inessential, what might today be called the center and the margin, or the dominant and the subordinate. Hegel's series of forms is unthinkable without the constant changing of places afforded by this formal alternation which is largely at one with what we have called positing. Thus, the beyond can be a secondary concomitant of perception and a way of organizing our relations with things, but it becomes essential in the religious conviction of its own inessentiality by the unhappy consciousness, in which the inaccessible beyond of God is posited as the essential. With the chapter on perception, a new opposition enters the picture which was not particularly significant in the moment of sheer sense perception, or sense certainty, that preceded it, and that is the opposition between the one and the many, between unity and multiplicity. For just as a multiplicity of sensations slowly reorganizes itself into the individual thing and its many properties, so also something like a unity of consciousness appears out of the delusion schizophrenia, the perpetual present, of the preceding moment of pure sensation. Indeed, it is this organizational primacy of the category of unity both in the object and the subject which will constitute Hegel's first evidence for that ultimate unity of subject and substances which he calls the speculative, and which is beyond all proof. But the relative positions of these two opposites are not given in advance. We may well perceive the thing first and foremost as a unity, in which case it is either a, an indifferent, passive universality, and also of many properties or rather matters, or b, negation, equally simply, or the one, which excludes opposite properties, 96/69. As the power of negation weakens, however, and the thing or object passes from the second of these emphases to the first, it becomes in the process a mere empty container for its many qualities or properties, form a, or in other words a third form, in which the many properties themselves are foreground and the thing becomes, in a memorable phrase, the point of singular individuality in the medium of subsistence radiating forth into plurality, der Punkt der Einzelheit in dem Medium des Bestehens in die Vielheit Australend. But this is scarcely to be read as a standard tripartite movement, insofar as now the individual properties themselves enter into opposition with each other, giving rise to a new and ever more complex dialectic which will only be completed by the emergence of the beyond of force or law behind the thing and its properties alike. This re-emergence of the formal problem of the beyond will now be codified in a new opposition, namely that between expression and essence or law, in which the singular phenomenon to be explained, by virtue of being endowed with an explanatory law of which it becomes a mere example, sinks to the inessential symptom of a more essential yet imperceptible or invisible in a reality, a drift which then generates the more general category of appearance or skin, sometimes awkwardly translated. Show, which is successively invested and disinvested, not only with the opposition between inessential and essential, but also with that stronger version of the same opposition, which alternates between passivity and activity. It is clear enough that such oppositions are designed to put order into this heterogeneous mass of data and to assign priorities such that scientific laws, of which causality is only one form, can be articulated and codified. But we must remember the satiric energy which the very concept of law calls forth in Hegel, and his passionately deconstructive repudiation of any naive attempt to use language, very much including the language of mathematics, in this one-dimensional or affirmative way. The notion of law at once calls forth the dialectic of the beyond on the one hand and that of the solin or the ethical imperative, the appeal to mere possibility or potentiality, on the other. The most famous Hegelian oppositions, positive and negative, identity and difference, are less to be regarded as the climax of this proliferation of binaries, than rather merely their strongest and most dramatic forms. Nor should we follow generations of Hegelian commentators in seeking to identify the ultimate forms in which such oppositions seem to be resolved, as though the greater logic were itself simply moving towards some ultimate revelation. Rather, it is preferable to grasp each moment as an interminable play of oppositions without any stable resting places, and this is best done by scrutinizing those passages in which several oppositions play back and forth against each other in alternating pairs, such that content and form, essential and inessential, active and passive, are alternately superimposed on inside forward/outside, self and other, identity and difference, unity and plurality, and the like. This will train us in the exercise of a non-teleological Hegel, one whose fundamental polemic target is Verstand or empiricism, ideologies of non-contradiction which produce the mirage of an affirmative action as well as the reifications of a substantialist worldview. What happens when we try to reintroduce temporality or the form of history itself into this polemic remains to be seen.